Listen to this carefully because this is where most men misunderstand their struggle and spend years fighting in the wrong direction. A man often imagines that the force working against him lives somewhere outside himself, in people who oppose him, in circumstances that feel unfair, in fate, in luck, in the world. This belief is comforting because it gives his discomfort a target. It allows him to say, "If only this were different, I would be at peace." But wisdom begins the moment a man realizes that the most persistent force shaping his life is not an external presence at all. It is a pattern of thought that repeats quietly inside him day after day until it feels like truth. Thoughts do not arrive wearing labels. They do not announce whether they are helpful or harmful. They arrive as explanations. They tell you why something happened, what it means about you, what you should expect next. And because they sound familiar, because they echo things you have heard before or felt before, you trust them. You rarely stop to ask where they came from or whether they deserve authority. A single thought has very little power. It passes like a cloud. But a thought repeated becomes a habit, and a habit repeated becomes a lens. That lens shapes how a man interprets everything he sees. Over time, he forgets that the lens exists. He believes he is seeing reality directly, when in truth, he is seeing through a pattern he has rehearsed for years. This is how a man can feel trapped without knowing when the cage was built. It was built gradually, quietly, through repetition, through sentences he told himself in moments of failure, through conclusions he drew in moments of pain, through assumptions he never questioned because they felt obvious. I have seen men with strength convince themselves they were weak. Men with ability convinced themselves they were incapable. Men with time convinced themselves it was too late. Not because it was objectively true, but because the mind learned a story and kept telling it. And the mind, if left unexamined, is loyal to repetition, not to truth. The mind does not ask whether a thought is good for you. It asks whether it is familiar. If you repeat, "This is just how I am," the mind accepts it as instruction. If you repeat, "Nothing ever works out for me," the mind begins to scan reality for evidence. If you repeat, "I can't change," the mind will protect that belief fiercely, because consistency feels like safety. This is why two men can experience the same failure and walk away with completely different lives. One uses it as information, the other uses it as identity. The event is the same, the interpretation is not. An interpretation lives in thought. A wise man learns to notice his inner dialogue without immediately believing it. He learns to listen the way one listens to weather, aware that it may influence the day, but does not define the landscape. He begins to ask simple but powerful questions. Is this a fact, or is this a conclusion I have repeated many times? Is this thought moving me forward, or keeping me familiar? That moment of questioning is not small. It is the first crack in the illusion. Because the greatest danger is not a destructive thought. The greatest danger is believing that the thought is you. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who hears them. The moment a man truly understands this, he stops being owned by every sentence that appears in his mind. Thoughts can be loud. They can be convincing. They can return again and again. But they are not commands unless he treats them as such. Most men confuse familiarity with truth. A thought that has been there for 10 years feels more real than a thought that challenges it, even if the challenging thought is healthier. This is why growth feels uncomfortable. It is not because it is wrong. It is because it is unfamiliar. The mind often presents its patterns as logic. It says, based on the past, this won't work. People like you don't succeed. You should stay where it's safe. These statements sound calm, rational, mature. That is why they pass unchallenged. But logic without courage becomes a prison. The past cannot dictate the future if the man himself is changing. A wise man understands that responsibility begins at the level of thought. Not responsibility as blame, but responsibility as authorship. He realizes that every repeated thought is a vote for the kind of life he is building. He may not control what thoughts appear, but he controls which ones he rehearses, which ones he feeds, and which ones he lets pass. When a man begins to see his patterns clearly, something important shifts. He stops searching for enemies in the dark. He stops fighting shadows. He recognizes that the real work is internal and precise. It is not dramatic, it is disciplined. This awareness does not make life easy. It makes it honest. A man may realize that some of the suffering he blamed on the world has been maintained by his own unexamined beliefs. This realization can sting, but it is also freeing, because what is learned can be unlearned. What is practiced can be practiced differently. A wise man does not attack his mind. He trains it. He understands that harshness strengthens resistance. Curiosity dissolves it. He watches how certain thoughts drain his energy and how others sharpen it. He notices which inner stories lead to action and which lead to paralysis. Over time, he becomes selective, and slowly the patterns weaken. Not because they are fought, but because they are no longer fed. Attention moves elsewhere, repetition changes, the lens shifts. This is how real power returns to a man, not through force, but through clarity. He no longer feels hunted by something outside himself. He understands that the real battleground has always been internal, and that awareness is the first act of reclaiming it. The moment a man realizes that what he fears is not an external force, but a repeated way of thinking, he stops running and starts choosing. Let me tell you something most men learn too late. The hardest battles are not fought in public, and they are not announced. They happen quietly in moments when no one is watching, when the world is silent and a man is left alone with his own thoughts. There are no witnesses to these struggles, no applause for endurance, no visible scars to justify the exhaustion. And yet, these unseen battles decide the direction of a man's life more than any external conflict ever could. A man can stand strong in front of others and still be collapsing inside. He can smile, perform, succeed, and be admired, while privately fighting thoughts that wear him down piece by piece. This is why appearances are misleading. Strength on the outside often hides fatigue on the inside. And because these struggles are invisible, a man often feels he must face them alone. The mind is a private arena. What happens there does not echo outward immediately, but it accumulates. Every unresolved fear, every unspoken doubt, every internal argument a man loses without realizing it leaves a mark. Not a mark others can see, but one that slowly reshapes how he shows up in the world. Many men believe that if no one else can see the problem, then it must not be serious. This belief is dangerous. Silence does not mean absence. It means concealment, and concealed struggles tend to grow stronger, not weaker, because they are never challenged openly. Think of how often a man pushes himself through the day while carrying a constant internal tension, a pressure to prove himself, a fear of being exposed, a feeling that he is behind, inadequate, or running out of time. These thoughts repeat quietly while he works, speaks, and interacts. He may not even notice them anymore. They have become background noise. But background noise still drains energy. The unseen battle is exhausting precisely because it never ends. There is no clear opponent to defeat, no final moment of victory. The struggle resets every morning. And when a man does not understand what he is fighting, he begins to believe that the fatigue itself is who he is. He says, "This is just my nature," when in truth, it is the cost of carrying unresolved inner conflict. A wise man learns to pay attention to what drains him when nothing is happening. Not when life is loud, but when it is quiet, because that is when the real dialogue begins. The mind fills silence with interpretation. It revisits old mistakes. It anticipates future failures. It compares, judges, and warns. And if a man does not know how to observe this process, he becomes trapped in it. The most dangerous part of these internal battles is not the discomfort they create, but the decisions they quietly influence. A man avoids opportunities not because he is incapable, but because an unseen voice convinces him it is safer to stay where he is. He settles for less, not because he lacks ambition, but because constant inner resistance makes striving feel unbearable. Over time, his life begins to reflect his avoidance rather than his potential. No one sees the moment he talks himself out of trying again. No one hears the internal negotiations where he lowers his expectations just to feel some relief. These moments do not look dramatic from the outside, but they shape destiny. There is also a particular loneliness in unseen battles. A man may be surrounded by people and still feel profoundly isolated because the struggle he is facing feels impossible to explain. He fears that if he speaks honestly, he will be misunderstood or judged, so he stays silent. And silence, while protective in the short term, becomes corrosive over time. A wise man understands that awareness is not weakness, it is the beginning of strength. He learns to turn his attention inward without flinching, not to criticize himself, but to understand the terrain. He notices patterns, which thoughts arise when he feels pressure, which stories repeat when he feels tired, which internal argue. NTS. He keeps losing. This observation alone begins to loosen their grip. You see, unseen battles thrive on automaticity. They remain powerful as long as they run without interruption. The moment a man sees them clearly, they are no longer invisible, and what is no longer invisible can be questioned. This does not mean the struggle disappears immediately. Awareness does not erase difficulty, but it changes the relationship. Instead of being dragged by every internal reaction, a man begins to stand beside it. He notices the urge to withdraw, the impulse to self-sabotage, the familiar wave of doubt, and instead of obeying instantly, he pauses. That pause is everything. In that pause, a man regains choice. He may still feel fear, but he is no longer ruled by it. He may still feel tired, but he no longer assumes that exhaustion defines his limits. He begins to understand that inner conflict is not a verdict, but a signal that something needs attention, not surrender. A wise man also learns that strength is not the absence of inner struggle. It is the ability to face it without pretending it does not exist. He stops demanding perfection from himself. He stops believing that strong men are those who never doubt. He realizes that strong men are those who notice doubt and move forward anyway. When a man brings light to his unseen battles, something remarkable happens. They lose their mystery. They stop feeling like a personal flaw and start looking like a human expiry. NCE. This shift alone reduces their power. Shame dissolves, clarity increases. The unseen battle does not require aggression. It requires honesty. It requires a man to admit, first to himself, what he has been carrying. Not to judge it, not to dramatize it, but to acknowledge it. Because what is acknowledged can be worked with. What is ignored continues to work against him. Over time, as a man becomes familiar with his internal landscape, he grows steadier. External chaos affects him less, because he is no longer at war with himself. He conserves energy. He acts with intention rather than reaction. He stops fighting shadows and starts directing his strength where it matters. This is the quiet truth. When a man learns to face the battles no one sees, he becomes unshakable in ways the world will never fully understand. The man who wins within no longer needs to prove himself without. Listen closely, because this is where many men mistake the voice in their head for wisdom when it is simply habit wearing a confident tone. Inside every man there is a constant conversation. It does not shout most of the time. It does not demand attention openly. It speaks calmly, reasonably, often using words that sound protective or intelligent. And because of that, it gains trust. This inner voice is shaped by three forces that grow quietly if they are never questioned: fear, doubt, and ego. Together, they form a narrator that feels personal, even intimate, but rarely neutral. Fear you surely speaks first. Its language is caution. It reminds you of past pain, of moments where things went wrong, of risks that did not pay off. It says, "Be careful, don't repeat that mistake, you know how this ends." Fear is not evil by nature. It exists to protect. But when it is allowed to lead instead of advise, it shrinks a man's life without him noticing. It convinces him that safety is the same as peace, and that avoiding discomfort is the same as wisdom. Doubt follows closely behind. Doubt does not question the world, it questions you. It asks whether you are capable, whether you are ready, whether you are enough. It replays comparisons. It highlights gaps instead of growth. It measures your beginning against someone else's middle and calls that fairness. And because doubt uses logic selectively, it sounds convincing. It never says you will fail. It says, let's be realistic. That is why so many men obey it without resistance. Then there is ego, the most misunderstood of the three. Ego does not only show up as arrogance. Often it appears as pride wrapped in insecurity. It wants to preserve an image, to avoid embarrassment, to maintain control. Ego fears looking foolish more than it desires growth. It would rather stay familiar than improve publicly. So it whispers, you don't need this, you're above that, or just as often, if you can't do it perfectly, don't do it at all. When these three work together, they create an inner voice that feels authoritative. It comments on everything you attempt. It judges your progress. It narrates your setbacks. Over time, a man stops noticing the voice itself and starts believing its conclusions. He thinks he is thinking freely, when in reality he is following a script written long ago. A wise man learns that the inner voice is not a single truth. It is a mixture of conditioning, memory, emotion, and repetition. Fear borrows from the past. Doubt borrows from comparison. Ego borrows from identity. None of them are concerned with who you could become. They are concerned with maintaining what is already known. This is why growth feels like resistance before it feels like progress. The moment a man steps toward change, the inner voice becomes louder. Fear lists consequences. Doubt questions ability. Ego worries about perception. And if a man has never learned to separate awareness from obedience, he mistakes resistance for a sign to stop. But resistance is not a warning. It is a signal. It signals that something familiar is being challenged. The inner voice becomes dangerous, not because it exists, but because it goes unquestioned. A man who believes every thought he has lives reactively. He does not choose his actions. He negotiates with his fears. He does not pursue clarity. He seeks relief. And relief always asks for smaller dreams. A wise man does not try to silence this voice. That would be impossible. Instead, he changes his relationship with it. He listens without bowing. He hears fear without letting it decide. He notices doubt without accepting its verdict. He observes ego without letting it guard his potential. This requires humility, not aggression. The moment a man fights his own mind, he loses energy. The moment he studies it, he gains leverage. He begins to notice patterns. When does fear speak the loudest? Usually before action. When does doubt intensify? Usually when comparison enters. When does ego intervene? Usually when identity feels threatened. With awareness, the inner voice loses its authority. It becomes information, not instruction. A wise man also learns that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear be the final voice. Confidence is not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to move while doubt is present. Maturity is not the destruction of ego, but the ability to keep it from running the mind. There is a subtle shift that happens when a man stops identifying with every thought. He creates space. In that space, choice appears. He may still feel hesitation, but he is no longer owned by it. He may still hear criticism, but he no longer confuses it with truth. Over time, this changes everything. Decisions become cleaner. Energy returns. A man stops exhausting himself with internal arguments he never wins. He acts with intention instead of justification. He begins to trust action more than analysis. The inner voice does not disappear, but it changes tone when it is no longer feared. Fear becomes a signal, no, a stop sign. Doubt becomes a question, not a verdict. Ego becomes a companion, not a ruler. And here is the quiet wisdom most men never hear. The voice that controls you is not the loudest one, but the one you obey. When a man learns to choose which voice leads, he finally begins to lead himself. Let me slow this down for you, because this truth is simple, but it is not shallow, and most men live their entire lives without truly grasping it. The mind does not grow by intention alone. It grows by exposure and repetition. Whatever you consistently place before it, Whatever you allow to repeat inside it, whatever you return to again and again, that is what it becomes skilled at producing. The mind is not loyal to your goals or your values. It is loyal to patterns. A man often believes that his thoughts are random, that his moods appear without cause, that his outlook is simply his personality. But personality is often just practiced thinking. Optimism, pessimism, confidence, hesitation, discipline, distraction. These are not traits you are born with fully formed. They are habits reinforced over time. Think of the mind like soil. It does not judge the seeds. It does not ask whether what you plant will nourish you or poison you. It accepts repetition as instruction. If you feed it fear-based stories, it will grow vigilance. If you feed it resentment, it will grow bitterness. If you feed it distraction, it will grow restlessness. And if you feed it clarity, patience, and challenge, it will grow strength. Most men underestimate how much of their mental energy is consumed passively. News, conversations, memories, entertainment, comparison, internal replay. None of these feel like training, but all of them are. The mind is always learning, even when you are not paying attention to what it is learning from. This is why a man can feel drained without having done anything physically demanding. His mind has been running in circles, chewing on the same material, reinforcing the same narratives. The exhaustion is not from effort. It is from repetition without progress. A wise man learns to notice what occupies his attention when nothing demands it. What does his mind return to in idle moments? Does it replay old conversations? Does it imagine worst-case scenarios? Does it compare his life to others? These defaults are not accidental. They are the result of what has been fed repeatedly. The mind becomes efficient at what it practices. If you practice worry, you become excellent at it. If you practice distraction, stillness becomes uncomfortable. If you practice avoidance, action begins to feel threatening. And if you practice focus, chaos loses its power. This is not about positive thinking, it is about honest training. You cannot lie to the mind and expect strength. The mind knows what you actually repeat, not what you wish you repeated. A wise man does not try to control every thought. That is unnecessary and impossible. Instead, he becomes intent. I know about what he allows to linger. He understands that attention is nutrition. Whatever stays in focus long enough gets stronger. This is why environment matters. The people you listen to, the conversations you entertain, the content you consume, the way you speak to yourself. All of these feed the mind. A man who wants clarity but feeds his mind constant noise is working against himself. A man who wants confidence but feeds his mind constant comparison is eroding his own foundation. Change does not begin with grand declarations. It begins with subtle shifts in input. What do you listen to in the morning? What do you dwell on at night? What stories do you repeat about yourself when no one is correcting you? These moments seem small, but they accumulate. The mind responds to consistency, not intensity. One inspired day does not outweigh weeks of unconscious repetition. This is why motivation fades. It is not reinforced. The mind returns to what it knows best. A wise man becomes disciplined not through force, but through alignment. He feeds his mind what supports the man he is becoming. Not perfectly, but consistently. He replaces constant consumption with selective intake. He gives his attention structure. Over time, something shifts quietly. Thoughts that once appeared automatically lose frequency. New thoughts feel awkward at first, like muscles that have not been used. But with repetition, they strengthen. Confidence becomes familiar. Focus becomes natural. Calm Beck. Ohms. Accessible. This is not a transformation that happens overnight. It is a reconditioning, and reconditioning requires patience. The mind resists change not because it is broken, but because it is efficient. It prefers known patterns. When a man understands this, he stops taking resistance personally. He no longer says, "Why am I like this?" He asks, "What have I been feeding?" That question changes everything. It moves him from self-judgment to self-leadership. A wise man also understands that deprivation is not the goal. He does not starve the mind. He nourishes it intentionally. He allows rest, but not escape. He allows pleasure but not numbing. He allows reflection but not rumination. This balance creates stability. The mind becomes a tool instead of a battlefield. Energy returns, decisions become clearer, emotional reactions soften, and slowly, without force, the man notices that his inner world reflects what he has been practicing. His mind begins to offer solutions instead of excuses, possibility instead of limitation, direction instead of noise. This is the quiet power of consistent feeding. You become what you repeatedly give your attention to. And when a man chooses his mental diet with care, his life begins to follow the same discipline. There comes a moment in a man's life when suffering no longer feels random. It feels repetitive. The same reactions, the same frustrations, the same internal conversations appearing again and again. This is not coincidence. This is pattern. And the moment a man begins to recognize these patterns clearly, without running from them or dressing them up, awareness is born. Awareness is not dramatic. It does not shout. But it is the moment authority quietly returns to the man. Most men live inside their thoughts, rather than observing them. A thought appears and immediately becomes a belief. A belief forms and becomes behavior. Behavior repeats and becomes identity. And somewhere along the way, the man forgets that there was ever a choice. He says, "This is just who I am," when in truth it is who he has been practicing. Awareness interrupts this chain. The moment a man notices a thought instead of merging with it, a small distance appears. That distance is not emptiness, it is power. In that space, the thought no longer commands automatically. It must justify itself. And many thoughts cannot survive being questioned. A wise man does not seek awareness to judge himself. He seeks it to understand. Judgment tightens patterns. Understanding loosens them. When a man watches his reactions without shame, he begins to see their mechanics. He notices how certain situations trigger predictable emotions, how certain emotions trigger predictable stories, how those stories lead him to the same outcomes. This observation alone weakens the grip of old patterns. They rely on speed and unconsciousness. When slowed down by awareness, they lose momentum. Awareness also reveals something important. Many of the thoughts a man believes are urgent are not actually necessary. They feel urgent because they are familiar. The mind confuses repetition with importance. A wise man learns to let thoughts pass without responding immediately. He realizes that not every thought requires action, defense, or explanation. This changes how he relates to discomfort. Instead of rushing to escape it, he stays present long enough to learn from it. He discovers that emotions rise and fall on their own when they are not fueled by interpretation. Anxiety weakens when it is observed instead of resisted. Frustration softens when it is acknowledged instead of suppressed. As awareness deepens, a man begins to see how often he has given his power away unconsciously. He notices the moments he reacts instead of chooses, the moments he seeks approval instead of alignment, the moments he avoids discomfort instead of growth. This is not comfortable to see, but it is honest. And honesty is the foundation of authority. Authority over oneself does not come from control. It comes from clarity. A man who understands his inner world is no longer easily manipulated by it. He can feel fear and still act. He can feel doubt and still commit. He can feel ego rise and still choose humility. Awareness does not eliminate these forces, it places them in their proper position. A wise man also understands that awareness is a practice, not a destination. It must be returned to again and again. The mind will always try to reclaim automaticity. It will always seek shortcuts. Awareness requires attention, and attention requires effort. But the effort is lighter than unconscious suffering. When a man practices awareness consistently, he begins to experience a subtle but profound shift. He feels less reactive, less rushed, less internally divided. Decisions become simpler because they are no longer driven by avoidance. He begins to act from intention rather than impulse. This does not mean life becomes easy. It means it becomes direct. Problems are faced instead of rehearsed. Conversations are clearer. Boundaries are firmer. Energy is conserved. Awareness also changes how a man relates to time. He stops living entirely in regret or anticipation. He becomes more present, and presence is where real choice exists. You cannot change the past, and you cannot control the future, but you can choose how you respond now. Awareness anchors a man in that truth. Over time, the man who practices awareness begins to trust himself again, not because he is perfect, but because he is honest. He knows when he is acting from fear, he knows when he is avoiding responsibility, and he knows when he is aligned. This self-knowledge creates stability. He is no longer surprised by himself. This is the quiet power of awareness. It does not require others to change. It does not wait for circumstances to improve. It begins internally and radiates outward naturally. A man who is aware is no longer easily provoked because he understands what is being touched inside him. He is no longer easily discouraged because he understands the difference between discomfort and danger. He no longer needs constant validation because he knows when he is acting in accordance with his values. This is what it means to reclaim authority over oneself. Not dominance, not suppression, but conscious participation in one's own life. And the moment a man sees himself clearly, he stops being controlled by what he refuses to look at. When a man reaches this point, something subtle but decisive begins to happen. He realizes that freedom is not a feeling that arrives one day, and it is not granted by circumstances finally improving. Freedom begins the moment he understands that his thoughts are choices, not orders. This understanding changes how he moves through life, because he no longer waits for his inner world to be quiet before acting with intention. Most men believe they will choose better once they feel better. They wait for confidence to appear, for clarity to settle, for fear to disappear. But this waiting keeps them locked in the same patterns. A wise man learns the opposite truth. Clarity follows choice, not the other way around. The act of choosing is what trains the mind. Every day a man makes thousands of small mental choices without noticing. He chooses which thoughts to dwell on, which stories to repeat, which emotions to indulge, which impulses to obey. These choices feel insignificant in isolation, but together they create direction. Freedom is not a dramatic rebellion. It is the quiet discipline of selection. To choose one's thoughts deliberately does not mean forcing positivity or denying reality. It means refusing to let the loudest thought become the leader by default. It means noticing what appears in the mind and asking a simple question: does this thought move me toward the life I am building, or does it keep me circling what I already know? A wise man understands that thoughts will always arise uninvited. He does not waste energy trying to prevent them. Instead, he decides which ones deserve rehearsal. A thought that appears once has little power. A thought that is rehearsed gains influence. Deliberate choice happens at the level of rehearsal. This is where many men falter. They believe choosing a thought once should be enough, but the mind is trained through repetition, not intention. Choosing deliberately means choosing again and again, especially when it is uncomfortable, especially when old patterns pull harder. Freedom is not the absence of inner resistance. It is the ability to move in alignment despite resistance. A man may feel fear and still choose courage. He may feel doubt and still choose commitment. He may feel anger and still choose restraint. These choices do not erase the emotion. They redefine authority. Over time, something important changes. The mind begins to offer different options, not because it has been silenced, but because it has been entrained. Thoughts aligned with growth appear more readily. Limiting narratives lose urgency. The inner world becomes less chaotic, not through suppression, but through leadership. A wise man also learns that deliberate thought does not mean constant control. He allows rest. He allows spontaneity. But when it matters, when direction is being set, he chooses consciously. He understands that freedom requires structure. Without structure, the mind defaults to old habits. Choosing thoughts deliberately also means choosing language carefully. The words a man uses internally shape his perception. Saying "I can't" closes doors. Saying "I'm learning" keeps them open. These are not tricks. They are frameworks. Language directs attention, and attention directs action. This practice also demands patience. Old thoughts do not disappear quickly. They return out of habit. A wise man does not become frustrated by this. He understands that consistency matters more than intensity. Each time he chooses deliberately, he weakens the old pattern slightly and strengthens the new one. There is also humility in this process. A man accepts that he will not choose perfectly every time. Freedom does not require perfection. It requires returning to awareness, returning to choice, returning to alignment. As deliberate choice becomes habitual, a man begins to feel a deeper sense of stability. External circumstances still change, challenges still arise, but his inner direction remains steady. He is no longer dragged by every emotional current. He navigates with intention. This is where true freedom reveals itself, not as escape from difficulty, but as authorship. A man becomes the author of his responses, even when he cannot control events. He may not choose what happens, but he chooses how it shapes him. Over time, others notice the difference, not because he announces it, but because his presence changes. He reacts less, he listens more, he acts with quiet confidence, his decisions feel grounded. This is the natural result of inner leadership. A wise man knows that freedom is not a destination, it is a practice renewed daily. Each day offers the same opportunity to let the mind run on old tracks or to choose deliberately. This choice may seem small, but it compounds. And in that compounding lies a simple truth. The man who chooses his thoughts chooses his life.